Hello, my name is Leslie McKesson, and I am privileged today to be here with Professor Annette Gordon-Reed. Welcome to Appalachian State University.
I'm very glad to be here.
We are pleased and happy to have you here. Hope you enjoyed a little bit of pretty scenery on the way.
It was gorgeous. It was gorgeous. I've never been in this part of the country, and it was great.
Well, come back anytime.
Oh.
We have a couple of particular books that are kind of front and center for you right now, one of which is The Hemmingses of Monticello. And I'd like to just talk with you a little bit about that, if you don't mind. Mm-hmm. That is a book for which you won the Pulitzer Prize. Mm-hmm. And one of the comments that the Pulitzer Prize selection committee made about your work was that it, quote, casts a provocative new light on the relationship between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. I love that, a provocative new light. So in light of your work and DNA results that have come about since then and other interventions, Monticello has changed the way they talk about slavery now. Mm-hmm. They've opened up Sally Hemings' living quarters as a tour space. That has to feel very gratifying to have been a part of bringing that about. What challenges or risks came about when you started to tell these non-traditional stories and tell them in ways that they had not been told before?
Well, the challenge was to get people to listen, mm-hmm. And I was very, very surprised to some degree, but very happy that when my books first came out, people were more receptive than I thought they would be to the story and to treating it as a real story. The difficulty is that there had been an image of Jefferson and a particular way of writing about life at Monticello that this necessarily has to change. You can't add a woman and 4 children to a man's biography without thinking. We have to think of him in a different way. So the challenge was to get people to open their minds and see that this kind of thing happened a lot in slavery. And just because it was Jefferson didn't mean that this was some wholly impossible kind of story. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Was there any particular group that had more resistance than another, or was it just kind of across the board?
Well, it wasn't across the board. As I said, I think people were more accepting of it than I thought they were going to be. Now, there are members of his legal family, his legal white family, who still dispute this, who don't accept this story. And I can understand that, because we all, we have our families and we draw our circles around them and we say who's in and who's out. And it wasn't their tradition, their understanding that the Hemmingses were in terms of biology. And so there are a number of them who still reject this. There are other members of the family who accept it. Mm-hmm. So I would say those are the people who have been the most recalcitrant about it. But for the most part, people have accepted it and have sort of moved on to other things, mm-hmm. because Jefferson is a complicated figure and there's a lot in his life, and being a slave owner overall is something to focus on. And I think that's what people are looking at right now more than just Hemings.
Okay. And he was, as you said, a complicated man. I think you've written maybe 3 books mm-hmm. that deal with Thomas Jefferson, mm-hmm. and kind of look deeply into his life. What are some of your thoughts about his positionality in terms of slavery? It was very kind of contradictory, I think, mm-hmm. in that he seemed to realize that slavery was not going to last forever, mm-hmm. that it may be going away at some point, but he did not take action to hasten the end of mm-hmm. slavery. Mm-hmm. How do you kind of justify or reconcile that?
Well, it's hard you can't justify it in a way, because there was nothing I think he could have done by himself about slavery, the entire system of slavery. He could have worked things so that he could have freed his own slaves, more of his own enslaved people. But But I think he was a person who saw himself as a progressive in lots of ways. He wanted to be like a person wanting to be a liberal, wanting to be a progressive, enlightened person. And he knew slavery was wrong, but he was born into this institution, and his first memories were of enslaved people, and we think some of his last images were of enslaved people who were taking care of him on his deathbed. And he just couldn't or would not lose himself from that. And the other thing about Jefferson too is that he was really interested in the project of the American Revolution. That was the most important thing in his life. And he wanted to make sure that the United States of America was a strong country, and he wanted to defend it against people whom he thought were enemies, the party, the people who were in the other party, opposite party. And so that's what he was fixated on. We want him to be fixated on slavery. We thought, this is the thing, look, this is the thing that's going to destroy this country that you think you're trying to protect. And he saw it as, that's something that will solve itself, that will eventually. But we know what happened. The country lasted until the mid-19th century, and then there was a civil war, and lots of people died, and slavery destroyed it. And those were things that you could think that the members of the founding generation might have paid more attention to, but they just sort of punted on that. And I think that was his. He was interested in other stuff, thinking that this was going to be solved, and it was solved, but it was solved in a way that he couldn't have imagined.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think what I'm hearing is that there was kind of a temporal context that he was working within, and there was a social structure that he was working within, and we may think of it in a contemporary context as, well, slavery was bad, you should have just done away with it. Mm-hmm. But there were other parts, moving pieces to the machinery that had the country going in the direction that it was going.
Yeah, and he was a person, as I suggested, who had his hand in lots of different things and was interested in lots of different things. And he was ahead of his time in some areas. In other areas, he wasn't. Mm-hmm. We think about the separation of church and state. He was adamant about that, and that was a very risky thing at that time period. And there were a lot of people who were deeply critical of him because of that. But we now know that we see kind of the importance of that, what can happen if you have religion taking over too much of a part of government, actual government function. One of the reasons the United States has maintained its status as a very religious country is that we did have that separation, and people were allowed to form their own religious beliefs and practice their own religious beliefs rather than having an established religion. Mm-hmm. In places where you have that, in Europe, nobody goes to church. The United States is super religious compared to that, and it's because of this, hands off of this religion. We're kind of forgetting that now, but so he was ahead of his time in some areas, and other areas he was not.
That's an interesting point, that our kind of pluralist background has been kind of a piece of what has kept the religious nature of this country.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
We're so much more religious than other Western nations and other places that have kept established religions, and we don't, and this has allowed religion to flourish. Mm-hmm. And as I said, I think we're kind of forgetting that now, but that's been a real strength of the country.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, as you describe and talk about Thomas Jefferson, it's very clear that he was a complex man. Mm-hmm. There were no necessarily black and white answers to some of the issues that we would think there would have been black and white answers to. Mm-hmm. And I think that's probably also true for Sally Hemings. Mm-hmm. And I believe your work with the Hemingses of Monticello did a lot to kind of elevate that and show her complexity. It's one of the things that I really appreciate about your work is that it's taken the historical information that you have and shown her story in a way that more likely reflects her viewpoint, and not just a viewpoint through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson. So what about the complexities of Sally Hemings that you kind of ran into in your work? What were some of those?
Well, the complexity, I wrote my first book about Jefferson and Hemings in '97, and just before the DNA came out, and then the Hemingses and Monticello later, and I really didn't understand her. I think I didn't have a good enough understanding of her until I worked on the Hemingses and Monticello, because I realized it's a mistake to think of her just by herself. She had a family. Mothers, she was a sister, she was a daughter, she was an aunt, a cousin, and to think about her in the framework of that entire family, I could kind of understand some of the choices that she made, some of her thinking about things, this whole question about whether or not she was going to stay in France or come back with Jefferson, and she decides to come back with Jefferson. And when I'm writing the first book, my question always is, why would you do that? And everybody asked me during that time, why would you do that? Why, if you had an opportunity to be a free person, even if it would be difficult in France, but it was difficult whenever black people ran away. That's like saying, oh, you have to stay with the slave owners or your life will be difficult, No. She and her brother, her older brother, probably could have made it. I know they could have made it there in France, and I thought, why would she come home? But then I realized she had family at home, and that was the dilemma that black people faced, enslaved people faced. Do you leave your family and take freedom by yourself, or do you stay with your family and try to make the best of what you can, make of things? And so the decision to come back made sense to me more after I wrote the Hemingses and Monticello, when I was writing about her mother and her sisters, and I got a chance to know them and to think of her in the context of that family. So this is a decision, as I said, that many enslaved people face. Do I run away or do I stay? And it's not that you like slavery and you want to be there. It's just that it's sometimes hard. And I think for women in particular, because women are conditioned to think about family and family responsibilities. And so she made more sense to me, and I really wanted to try to get people to think of her as a person, as an individual who was enslaved. She was part of this system, but she had her own personality, she had her own context. She understood Jefferson and his connection to, because it's not just Jefferson and Sally Hemings, it's Jefferson and his relations with her brothers, her sisters, her mother, her father, his father-in-law, because Jefferson's wife and Sally Hemings were half sisters. And so there's this web of relationships here that you have to think about. You can't just say enslaved woman, enslaver, and that answers all the questions. It answers some questions, but once you think about the nature of their connections, then you can sort of think about their lives at Monticello.
I also appreciated that discussion or that point, because it raised an element of agency for Sally Hemings. It was certainly not a set of decisions that anyone would choose to make, given that choice. But within her sphere, within the constellation of choices that she was able to make, she used that agency and she decided how she would govern herself in a way that would protect and preserve her family.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's important to note, because she she, along with other African American people, even in the United States, who had an opportunity, could use law. French law was on her side. She knew that, and Jefferson knew that. And you very often see in slavery African American people, again, even in the United States, when they had an opportunity to use law, they did. The law was important, and they filed freedom suits. They threatened to file. She, would have filed a freedom suit, and it would have been granted because all of them were granted in Paris anytime they filed a petition. So, knowing the law, I think it was important to emphasize that. And people say, well, she couldn't have done this, and she couldn't have. But that's just another way of, I think, talking about black powerlessness, or emphasizing that a black incompetence or black fear or whatever. But she knew the law was on her side and threatened to use it and negotiated terms for herself and her family based upon that law.
And her brother, I think, had a more sad end.
Yes.
Suicide, I believe.
Yes, he was. That was the report, that he committed suicide in 1801 after, he'd been back in the United States for, by then, like almost 12 years, and Jefferson had freed him, and he had embarked upon a life of sort of traveling different places. We have a sense that he may have gone back to France. There's a report of him going to Spain. And so he had this very active life, but you think about a person who was trained in some of the best kitchens in France, and then to come back to the United States, what was there for an African American man who had those kinds of experiences and had known that kind of freedom? And he began to drink, and so you just know what kind of pressures are on people. Again, he's free. But his family, the bulk of his family, is up on the mountain in Monticello. Yeah. Must have been
Incredibly difficult for enslaved people to make that type of choice. You think about the blacks that we herald and speak of as escaping through the Underground Railroad. Even those who did that had to make the choice to leave their family behind and to start virtual as individuals when they got to their new destination.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, it's like making a choice for the next generation if they're young, if they were young and of childbearing age or whatever, making a choice for the next generation over the one before. And I think the ones who remain behind would understand that, but still, it's just excruciating. It's an excruciating choice, and that's the tragedy and the evil of slavery, that people were put in that position.
That really kind of resonates with the work that I've done with my ancestor. I have a great-great-grandmother who was enslaved and who had 8 children with her owner, and she, after emancipation, chose to remain in the same place where she had been enslaved and where most of her children had been enslaved. And I believe, very similar to what you're describing with Sally Hemings, that her decision was based on her family and keeping her family together. So, yeah.
In one place. Now that's fascinating. And you know where this is and all? Oh.
Yes. Still, my son still lives in that community, actually. So very kind of a long-term, still existing family story there. Appalachian this year is doing a common read on a book called Junaluska. It's a collection of oral histories from Black Appalachian community members. And the stories, some of them go back to people who were born as long ago as 1885. So in addition to people like me who are exploring our family backgrounds, folks like the ones who contributed to the book Junaluska, do you have any suggestions, recommendations about ways that we can pursue these stories and build additional context for the stories that we have? Because we are not going to have the treasure trove of historical information that's available about Thomas Jefferson and his household. Are there any suggestions or recommendations that you might give to those of us who are doing some similar research, but our families don't have that wealth of historical data?
Well, it's tough. I mean, as you know, it's very, very tough. But there are official records. I mean, blacks don't show up in the census until the 1870 census, and by name or so forth. But even those, like I was able to find, that because they often ask them, where were your parents born? And so if you have somebody in the 1870 census, they can tell you, they will say, my parents were born in Virginia or whatever. So I think it's detective work. Yeah. It's tough detective work that you have to do to try to find out where maybe they were enslaved and by whom they were enslaved. And it's not uncommon. It was not uncommon for enslavers to have records because it's a business. And enslaved people were inventory. And so you can, very often, sometimes people are able to trace, if they can find out the plantation where people were, there are often records of, and I know in University of Virginia, there's a whole floor of plantation records from people, and there may be in North Carolina as well. I'm not as familiar with North Carolina, but it's detective work, and it's tough detective work. But the key is going through all the kind of public records you can, as far back as you can, and then trying to figure out, either through oral histories or whatever, the connection to slave owners. And that's tough because a lot of times great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents didn't want to talk about all of this stuff and just wanted to put that behind. But it's sleuthing work that can be fun and frustrating, but it's not impossible. I mean, as I said, Jefferson wasn't the only person who kept records. There are other plantation records and family letters. You have to. The maddening thing about this often is you have to go through the family histories of white people very often to find stray references to people, and sometimes it's almost a needle in the haystack, but it does happen.
You can find those peripheral references, and I think DNA can add a little piece to some of that information. My great-great-grandmother's paternity was always in question until probably 3 years ago when DNA identified who is believed to be her father, and it made a ridiculous amount of sense. Once we heard it, it just made so much sense. So I think there's just a variety of ways.
That's a good point, because that's a new way into all of this now, and a lot of those things are public records, and certainly of a number of the prominent families in Virginia, people have been connected to other people who've given their DNA. They find matches and so forth. So that's another. So records and science are coming together to answer a lot of these questions.
Yeah, that's a good thing. I'd like to get your thoughts on a process of kind of historical analysis. Read a book recently that's a very popular book. I'm sure you're familiar with it. Tia Miles, All That She Carried, the story of Ashley Sack, the journey of Ashley Sack. And she also has an interesting approach to telling the stories of people for whom there are no records, by basically gathering these peripheral histories and examining the lives of the subject she wants to study in light of those peripheral histories. Did you have to consult with anything of that nature in your work, or did you find that there was ample information available that was directly related to the Hemingses and the Jeffersons.
Well, I would say for Elizabeth Hemings, I have a chapter called Young Elizabeth's World. I have to do sort of like a history of Williamsburg. She's born in 1735, and the story is that she was the daughter of a person who was full-blooded African. That was her grandson described it. And so I needed to know what Williamsburg was like. Would it be likely that how likely would it be that there would be full-blooded Africans in Williamsburg? And it turns out to be very likely because there were that was sort of the high point of bringing Africans into that area in the 1730s. It was a port. Madison Hemings says that it was a big port at that time, Williamsburg, and it's not a port now, but it was then. And so I had to piece together that world. I called it Young Elizabeth's World because I don't have enough information about her as a child to be able to, besides when she was born, who owned her, those kinds of things. But I had to paint the picture of what that place was like. And I think I did that more for her than other members of her family, because once you get to Monticello, Jefferson is keeping records of all kinds of stuff. And so there are his memorandum books, there are letters. Some members of the Hemings family were literate, so there are letters from them as well. But it's really Elizabeth Hemings where I do have to try to do what Taya does and sort of paint a picture of what the world, the context of the world that she lived in, mixed with a few things that I know about her.
I really enjoyed that piece. It just seemed to give so much context to her life, and I think it's an important way of trying to contextualize and tell the stories that we don't have any other way to tell, because we don't have that data from those people. So,
and I just don't think you shouldn't give up. I mean, just because there was a deliberate effort to obscure these people, to keep them obscure, and I don't think the people who did that should win by saying, "Oh, the only way you can tell these stories is if you have letters from these people," because first place, letters, you can say anything in a letter.
Absolutely.
And so I'm not saying that letters are important, but they too have to be corroborated. You have to research around them too. So I think you have to use whatever tools are available.
And as we talk about looking at letters, primary documents, interpreting them. When we interpret these artifacts, we are interpreting them through a contemporary lens. So the interpretations that we placed on them may or may not actually reflect the lived experiences that those folks had. So how do we still bring value from that process?
Be honest about the fact that we can only see things through our eyes, but we can do enough research about the time period to sort of understand what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. What were people doing then? When were people marrying? What's the average age? All those kinds of things. We can do that research around it, as we were talking about before. But you do have to keep in mind that we can only see the world through our eyes. But what a historian tries to do is to do enough research and find out as much as you can about the place to say, well, that makes sense. This is the way people did things. It's very different. An age of consent at 10. An age of consent at 12. They raised it to 12 in the 1820s, and it stayed there until the 20th century. And now it's we're raising it now. We've finally seen the light on all of this, but you have to know that it changes things to realize that people had a different sense about when a person became an adult at the time. I mean, now it's 35, maybe. It keeps getting older and older. But those kinds of things can help you put all of this stuff in context. And I think if you're honest with the reader about what you're doing, and you can say, well, this is my interpretation of it, this is what I know about it, they can come along with you or not, but to be as transparent as possible, I think, is what you have to do.
Okay. And thinking about the value that we ascribe to the decisions that they made, to kind of extracting that piece of it.
Oh, yeah.
Trying to be value, not judgment.
Yeah, not judgment. Because I could say, when I was working on my first book, why are you coming back here? But when I think about it, when I realized that she had the family here, and she evidently trusted him. And Madison Hemmings said she trusted Jefferson, and that's another thing that kind of gives me pause and say, why would you do that? But I realized that she had a connection. She had seen him deal with her family in a particular kind of way, because her family was his wife's family. They were, like I said, his wife's half sister, and so that meant something to him. It didn't have to, but all of the available evidence indicates that it did matter to him, and she knew that, and she used that. I mean, I would imagine that all throughout their lives they used that connection to try to get things that they wanted, to strike the best deal for themselves that they could, because who wouldn't? That's the way human beings, you use what you have.
That's her agency. Again. Yeah. Well, it has been a great pleasure. I could talk to you for hours and just ask question after question after question. I had a few more that I wanted to get to, but we didn't get to. But thank you so much for being here at Appalachian State University, and we look forward to hearing your lecture tonight. And hope you have a very enjoyable stay here on campus, though it'll be short.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah.
Thanks.